Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of The Book Club. I am your host, Anoop Johal, and I want to thank everyone for tuning in for today's episode. Now, most of you know that lately I've been on this journey in my Indigenous Studies class. And pretty much I have been not only learning more about Indigenous history, but learning more about the issues that are taking place in these Indigenous communities, such as the high amount of drug abuse in teenagers or the sexual assault that Indigenous women and men are facing in these communities, and the missing and murdered Indigenous women. So pretty much I was able to learn a lot about the Indigenous communities throughout Canada and how they're treated, and how Canada, a country, is treating them, and how us as a community that we aren't showing that much recognition to the Indigenous communities around Canada. So in today's podcast, I want to take a different approach to today's podcast, and so I do it where I'd come in, give a summary of the book I'm reading and end it. But today I kind of want to take a different approach where, I'm able to give a summary about the book I'm reading, kind of tell you guys about the novel, how I felt about it, and also related to the podcast Finding Cleo, which most of you know that I've been listening to for quite a while now, and also pretty much end my podcast off with me sort of spreading awareness and kind of encouraging my viewers, encouraging my audience to kind of take that step forward and to kind of make a change of these issues. Because I feel like as a community, as a team, as a family, I feel like we're not showing that much recognition, and I feel like that we as a community, we as a family should take a step forward and show awareness to these Indigenous communities and to the Indigenous families. So enough talking, let's get right into the podcast.
Round one. Fight, 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 fight.
All right, so let's get to it. So Bernice is a survivor of sexual assault, and her story spans both original abuse, which occurred mostly when she was a child, and the resulting trauma, which continued to affect her during the events that take place in the book. Her experiences result in a period of time spent in mental ward, and another period where she's no longer able to speak or interact with the world due to all the trauma she's faced. The novel begins off with Bernice laying in bed in her rented room above the bakery in Gibsons, British Columbia. Throughout the novel, Bernice is recalling these memories and traveling through her dreams to places she's lived in the past. There's a continuous change between the past and the present, which makes this book a bit unique. Her memory and reality, dreaming and being awake. Bernice is a fantastic character in this novel. However, we learn nearly right away that she's repeatedly sexually assaulted as a child. She's loving and resilient, raised by a single mother who disappeared on her one day, which kind of gets me a bit curious because throughout the novel we don't learn much about her mother and why she disappeared. Bernice lived in multiple different areas, from living with her beloved Aunt Val, to living in a white foster family, to living on the streets homeless of Edmonton, then to living in a psychiatric facility. The novel begins off when Bernice decides to move to Gibsons, British Columbia. During that time, there was a famous television show called The Beachcombers. For most of you that don't know, it was sort of a comedy television show that was famous around that time. And this TV show was actually filmed around that specific area in BC. So Bernice sort of had this crush on one of the actors that was named Pat John. So what her intention was when she moved to Gibsons, British Columbia, she somehow dreaded to meet Pat John, and he was one of the actors in this television show. So eventually, when Bernice moves to BC, she didn't complete her quest on finding the actor, I should say. Eventually, Bernice finds a job in a bakery that is owned by a lovely lady named Lola. She's a white person who really acts like she's never met an Indigenous person before. And which I found really nice and kind, that Lola feels responsible for protecting Bernice in the bakery. And throughout the novel, we see Bernice engaging in some risky sexual behavior where she is becoming a prostitute. And in her time in BC, Bernice unfortunately had this mental breakdown one night that took her to the bed, where she was unconscious and able to speak, move, or do anything. Since Bernice is confronting her own history and her own past, the book at certain points does get very confusing. As you read along, sometimes the timeline will shift around, and it gets confusing during certain events. But personally, for me, when I was reading this novel, I felt that it was easy for me to kind of go back to the section again, read it over to kind of get a better understanding. I recommend that once you guys read this novel more than once, you'll be able to distinguish between the dreams, the memories, and living in like the current day. But other than that, something very unique about this book is at the beginning of each chapter, it starts off with a Cree word or a Cree sentence that I found very interesting and unique. And with the translation next to it, followed by a fable or a story, which often led to something that was happening in that chapter, which I found very unique. Now, when you read Birdie throughout the novel, most women in Birdie have been broken in some sort of way. As it is evident, most women in that novel, such as Lola, such as Bernice, such as Aunt Val, they've each gone through something throughout their life that emotionally scarred them or affected them. And as a result, they put themselves at risk with these dangerous men. So, although we get an understanding from Bernice's memories as to why she behaves this certain way and why she does the things she does, her intentions behind it, it's a bit of a mystery for me, because I'm curious and I want to figure out why the other women, such as Aunt Val, how come they were treated in this horrible way and horrible condition. So this is something I want to figure out more about, and want to ask the author, okay, so what happens with Bernice's mom? What happens with Aunt Val? And I want to know their story and the things that were going on in their life and how they were being controlled by these dangerous sort of men. And one thing I found very effective throughout this novel was, while I was reading, the most effective part of the book, it was beyond one sentence referencing the residential schools and their effects to stomp out the indigenous cultures. This book does not talk a lot about residential schools, the 60s schools, as it is not mentioned throughout the novel very much. Just keep in consideration of the residential schools in the 60s scoop. This novel, Birdie, demonstrates the dangers that she's given in being an indigenous woman, such as how they get treated in today's society and in their community. Throughout the novel, it is evident that we see the reserve system and the residential school is shown to be responsible for the poor treatment of these indigenous women, and the reason behind the residential schools and the reserve system, on why these women were poorly treated and why these women were assaulted at such young ages throughout their lives. But also, it demonstrates and shows us the power that these indigenous women have to help heal themselves. Throughout the novel, we see Birdie go through such a very tough time, a horrible time, but we see her as a character healing herself throughout this process. Even though she's been sexually assaulted from her uncle, been in a lot of sexual risky behavior, relied on substance abuse, she's still able to heal herself. And with the power these indigenous women have to help heal themselves and to forget about all the horrible things that they lived in the past. And this message is very strong to me, because this message goes out to the modern day culture, and then we can understand and exactly what it is to show the recognition about the horrifying fact of the missing and murdered women throughout Canada. So now, of you that don't know at this point, I mentioned in my previous podcast about Finding Cleo. And for those of you that haven't checked out Finding Cleo, as I said in my previous podcast, I highly recommend it. It's basically about an indigenous family on the search for their deceased sister. And after all 6 siblings were separated and adopted out during the 60s scoop, basically after being in their new homes after a few years, the siblings were given the information that their sister had unfortunately died. As adults, they spent about 20 years of their lives searching for more information on the death of Cleo. how she died, where she died, and where her remains were. But the Canadian government made it incredibly difficult to find out information and to provide them information about what had happened to Cleo. The journalist who kind of hosts this podcast set out a mission to find out what happened to Cleo and to find her grave and to find her siblings. I highly recommend watching this podcast. This podcast not only was very interesting, but it also gave me a different view and different perspective on how these indigenous peoples were treated throughout the 60s scoop. It gave me a different lens of thinking and a perspective of thinking. And I got emotional at some parts because it was so sad and so tragic on what happened to Cleo, and I highly recommend my viewers watch this. So as you know before, as I talked about Birdie, Birdie is an example of what First Nation women lives and experiences were. The connections between them and what had happened when those connections were broken with identity lost. Just thinking more about the 1,000 missing and murdered women across the country. So now, after reading this novel and after watching episode of Finding Cleo, I'm basically going to go through both podcast and both novel, listing the similarities and the things they had in common, and something I later on want to talk about the missing and murdered Indigenous women. So, as it is evident throughout the podcast and throughout the novel, both Cleo and Birdie were living similar lifestyles, if you would say. Cleo was taken away, unfortunately, from her birth home as she was placed into a middle-class family, as well as Bernice losing her mother at a very young age and not having any connections with her own family as well, traveling around place to place. Both of them were on a quest to either find their families or find someone they desired. For instance, Cleo wanted to go back to her home, to go back to her family, to go back to her siblings, to go meet them. And the other side, Bernice was on a quest to go find John Pat from the TV series The Beachcombers. Both Cleo and Bernice faced a type of abuse, and this abuse would haunt them for the rest of their lives and causing trauma within. They either faced a form of physical and emotional abuse. And one thing I want to discuss and would like to take time is about the horrors of the residential schools and the 60s scoops. Both Birdie and Finding Cleo, this was a major aspect of what was happening. The residential schools in the 60s scoops was something big that was going on. The actions by the Canadian government during that time was very poor. They did not take any action to go find these missing and murdered Indigenous women. And I was horrified by the own ignorance as I listened to the season of Missing and Murdered and learned about the very, very real personal ways that the number of lives that were horrifically impacted. Now, for my audience members, those of you that aren't very known of what was happening during the 60s scoop. So the 60s scoop refers to the large scale and the removal of these Indigenous children from their home and their communities and families since the 1960s, placing these children in a non-Indigenous middle-class families across the United States and Canada. And personally, when I was learning about the 60s scoop, it hurt me so much because me picturing my younger sister and picturing my little cousins, just thinking about the fact that someone coming into our homes and taking them out of our homes and placing them somewhere around the country that we had no idea got me very angry, because why was the Canadian government treating these children? They made it seem like these residential schools were going to help them, but all it did was causing the loss of identity and so on. This experience left many of these children with lost sense of cultural identity. The physical and emotional separation from their births continues to affect adults to this day and to the Indigenous communities to this day. And the long-lasting effects of the 60s scoop of the adults are considerable. From the cultural loss of identity to the low self-esteem and the feeling of shame, loneliness, depression, and confusion. Since birth, their records could not be opened unless the child or parent consented. Many of these adoptees learned about their true heritage late in life, which is very frustrating to me because this whole life you're pretty much living a lie, not knowing anything about your true identity, about your religion. And pretty much when it comes to a point of your life where you are questioning yourself, like, okay, what was my religion as a kid? What faith did I believe in? It's very frustrating, and it caused a lot of indigenous peoples to be very frustrated and emotionally distressed. While some adoptees were placed in homes with loving support and supportive people, I wouldn't really say loving support because most of these homes were very abusive to these children. If these children were caught practicing their own beliefs or their own cultures, they would be punished for that, which sort of gets me very frustrated and sort of mad that how they were treated in such poor conditions when even taken out of their homes, placed into another family. Even though they tried to provide education and experiences of a creation of healthy indigenous identities, some of these people that were adopted and placed in these homes, residential schools, were sexually, physically, and emotionally abused and assaulted. And this varied in experiences and feelings that led to long-term challenges with the health and livelihood of these kids that were adopted during that time. So as we know to this day that substance abuse is something that is a big issue in these indigenous communities. And I feel like the residential schools and the 60 schools were responsible for this substance abuse, and these kids are pretty much killing themselves because due to all the pain that they faced back in the day, they're pretty much putting all their pain on this alcohol, on these drugs, to forget about the pain, and causing themselves to do self-harm on one another or to assault one another physically or emotionally. So now we're at a point where we've learned about what had happened throughout this time. And personally, me, I found it very frustrating. When I was able to read the book, Birdie, and also listen to the podcast, I was very frustrated and I felt like I was not educated that much. And I feel like this is our Canadian history. Most of us are so proud of Canada on how there's such a country that allows anyone, any race, any gender to freely practice their religion, but we don't take in consideration of all the negative things they did in the past and some things that they are not living up to this day, which gets me very frustrated. And I feel like us as a community and us as a society aren't doing much to sort of spread awareness and to show recognition. So it is 2018, and I feel like our community and our society should be doing their best to spread awareness on the way how some Indigenous women are being mistreated in today's society. And it gets me frustrated knowing that there's not enough being done from the government and from us as well. So today I want to take a step forward, spreading awareness around my community. And although it's not going to be such a crazy big movement, I want to take that step forward and educate people around my community, educate people in my school. I'm trying to bring this movement to my community by taking a step and hanging up posters around my community and around my school. Basically, giving them links to this podcast to sort of enlighten them and educate them about Indigenous peoples and the way they were mistreated throughout the time in Canada, and how we as a society and as a community should show some recognition towards. Listening to Finding Cleo gave me a whole new different perspective on how Indigenous people were treated and how they were being treated to this day. So it's time for us to open our eyes and to spread the word and start educating one another of the brutal mistreatment of the missing and murdered Indigenous women. So now I've said my part and I've done my part, and I'm still going to continue to do my part, but it's up to you. My viewers, my audience, it's up to you guys to take the next step and to begin your movement. Whether it may be something small or whether it may be something big, just spreading the word and telling people about what is going on in the Indigenous community, everything they had been through with the missing and murdered Indigenous women. Kind of motivate my viewers a bit, just know this, that movements aren't born. They're birthed by a courageous individual who has turned their pain or frustration into a mission to serve others. So my mission today is by encouraging my audience to take the step forward to spread this awareness and to spread this recognition. It's up to you guys to do so. So I'm starting my journey right now. I'm beginning my journey and my movement by going around my high school and questioning a few students here at Jean Augustine Secondary School to why they think sexual rates are higher in Indigenous communities. This essential question will be asked to those students, And by asking these students this essential question, my goal is to get an insight on why this may be an issue in today's society. Also asking them a follow-up question on how they may encourage their community to make a change, to show recognition of the missing and murdered Indigenous women. All right, guys, so I'm interviewing my first classmate. His name is Vineeth, and I'm going to be asking him the question. So, Vineeth, why do you think sexual assault rates are higher in Indigenous communities?
Well, I believe this because I think it's just mainly because of how women are, like how Indigenous women are treated across like Canada or in their individual communities, and this can all date back to like residential schools where, when they were children, they could have went to residential schools, and the way they were treated by their nuns and priests there for doing the most smallest mistakes, for like example, like representing their culture in any type of way. And this could also date back to how like a lot of Indigenous communities go through like lots of drug abuse. So then many communities, like many people, they take a lot of drugs, and because of that they can influence other people within the community to take drugs with them.
So I have a question now. So you as a student attending Jean Augustine, how would you spread awareness of sexual abuse and the trauma that Indigenous women face? What would you do to take the next steps to tell people about this issue and sort of let like the school know more about it?
Well, one thing like for example, if we were in our activism course, right, we can take this as an issue and just mainly like try to figure out many solutions for this problem, some of which can include like mainly informing the public about like how Indigenous people were treated and how they're being sexually abused. So we could talk about that, find the problems as to why they're doing that, as to why they're being abused, and based off that information you can also find solutions. But what I would do specifically is, one, inform the public, two, just find some sort of facts to solidify my thesis, I guess, to prove that these or how Indigenous people are being treated like this.
So I'm interviewing one of my second classmates, Manjat. And Manjat, I'm going to ask you the question that I asked Vineeth previously. So why do you think sexual assault rates are higher in Indigenous communities rather than other communities around Ontario?
So I personally believe that because they're a minority in our community or around Canada, they're being taken advantage of. And not just that, but their past relationships with Canadian government that hasn't been so good, they're just being used. Example, something I can find like residential schools and the past generational trauma they faced with 60 Scoop and that sort of thing, and drug abuse and substance abuse.
So Manjat, so you feel like that due to the past trauma that these Indigenous peoples faced throughout their lives, you feel that it's responsible for them having a high risk and high rates of them getting sexually assaulted?
Yeah, I agree. The book I'm reading, The Reason You Walk, the father went through the residential schools, and in order to ease that pain, he did a lot of substance abuse such as alcohol in a result of being beat physically and mentally by the nuns and the staff who worked there. And what that caused was family relationships being torn apart between his son because of the physical abuse he was in.
So you've given your input on why may Indigenous communities face more sexual assault rather than other communities. Now, I want to know, how would you create a change, or what steps would you take to sort of make a change in showing recognition to these missing and murdered Indigenous people?
So my first steps would be creating a campaign ad, maybe on social media such as Twitter, using a hashtag or hashtag that's already been used. Maybe a Facebook page, because a lot of viewers or audiences that log into Facebook usually are adults who can create change. My next would be probably contacting my MP, maybe telling them about the issue, but also using my teachers as a resource, so I can explain them maybe something we can learn in class to educate other students to add in the curriculum.
So I hope my viewers and my audience, I hope I taught you guys something and that you guys learned something from today's podcast. As you guys do know, I release podcasts every single month on the novel. And this month's podcast, I was very passionate about my topic. I hope you guys can share this podcast, let more people know about it, and sort of spread the word about making a change in our society, in our community, by spreading the word of the missing and murdered Indigenous women. I want to thank everyone for listening to my podcast. Please stay tuned, like, rate, comment, and subscribe, and share this to your friends and family. Let them know about the books I'm reading and the issues that are happening in today's society and to this day. So I hope you guys learned something. I want to thank everyone for tuning in, and I hope you guys have a wonderful day.
Round one. Fight, 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 fight.